Hello, Pisces. Before I even started laying out the cards, I could already feel something shifting in this energy. And honestly, the moment the star appeared, I had to stop for a second and really sit with what was coming through. Because this doesn't feel like a story about someone who forgot you. It feels like a story about someone who thought they had more time. More time to figure things out. More time to say what they really felt. More time before everything changed. Okay, but something feels different now. Someone is looking at you in a completely different light. They're realizing that you're no longer standing in the same place you once were. And wow, the energy around this feels emotional. Almost like a quiet realization is beginning to catch up with them. So get comfortable, Pisces. Take a deep breath, grab your favorite drink, and just allow yourself to be present with this reading. Because what is coming through today feels deeply personal. And I have a feeling we're only seeing the beginning of the story. Let's get into your reading. Okay. So the first thing I'm noticing here, Pisces, is that this energy doesn't feel loud. It doesn't feel dramatic. It actually feels very quiet, very private, very personal. And somehow, that makes it even more powerful. Because as I'm looking at these cards, especially with the star appearing right at the center of this energy, I keep getting the feeling that someone has been watching you from much farther away than you realize. Not necessarily in a creepy way. More like someone who keeps checking, someone who keeps wondering, someone who keeps looking for signs that maybe things are still the same. Maybe you still feel the same. Maybe you're still waiting. Maybe there's still time. But that's where everything begins to shift, because the version of you they remember isn't the version of you they're seeing now. Wow. That realization feels much heavier than they expected. You know, Pisces, sometimes people get comfortable with the idea that you'll always be there. Not because they don't care, not because they don't value you, but because your heart has always felt safe to them. Your presence has always felt familiar, almost like home, and for a very long time, this person believed that no matter how much distance existed between the two of you, some invisible thread would always remain untouched. But lately, that certainty has started to disappear, and I think it's scaring them. Because as I look at the Queen of Cups, I don't see someone chasing. I don't see someone waiting at the door. I see someone who has learned how to sit peacefully with their own emotions. Someone who no longer needs constant answers. Someone who has stopped forcing things. And honestly, that might be exactly what this person wasn't prepared for, because they knew how to handle the old version of the connection. They knew how to live with the idea that you cared. They knew how to postpone difficult conversations. They knew how to tell themselves they would deal with everything later. But now, later doesn't feel guaranteed anymore. This is interesting, because the energy around the Page of Swords keeps pulling my attention back toward them. It's almost like they're trying to understand what happened, trying to figure out when the shift occurred, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything started feeling different. Was it something you said? Something you stopped saying? Something you stopped doing? They're searching for answers. They're replaying memories. They're looking back at old conversations, old moments, old opportunities. And the more they look, the more they realize the change didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, quietly, one day at a time, while they were busy assuming everything would remain exactly where they left it. And now they don't know what to do with that realization, because the Nine of Swords feels incredibly emotional here. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just deeply unsettling. Like somebody lying awake after everyone else has gone to sleep, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things they should have said, all the things they should have done, wondering if they waited too long, wondering if they misunderstood what was happening, wondering if the opportunity they thought would always be there is slowly slipping through their fingers. And Pisces, I don't think this fear is coming from ego. Honestly, it feels more vulnerable than that. Because what I'm sensing is someone beginning to understand your value in a completely different way. They're seeing your peace. They're seeing your growth. They're seeing the way you've continued moving forward without demanding anything from them. And strangely enough, that is exactly what's making them pay attention. Because they expected reactions, they expected emotions, they expected signs. What they didn't expect was your calm. What they didn't expect was your silence becoming so powerful. Okay, let me say this. There is a difference between someone walking away angry and someone simply choosing themselves. This person understands that difference now. And that's why the energy feels so heavy. Because they can sense it. They can feel that something inside you has settled. Something inside you has matured. The Queen of Cups keeps showing me someone who still has a beautiful heart, but no longer abandons themselves to prove their love. And wow, that realization is changing everything for this person. because they're looking at you and seeing someone stronger than before, softer than before, wiser than before, someone who doesn't need to chase, someone who doesn't need to convince, someone who doesn't need to wait forever. And the more they recognize that, the more nervous they become. Because distance suddenly feels real, not symbolic, not temporary, real. The kind of distance that grows when two people stop meeting each other halfway. The kind of distance that appears when opportunities remain untouched for too long. And honestly, I think that's what they're beginning to confront. The possibility that life is continuing to move, that you are continuing to move, and that the version of you they always assumed would be there might be becoming someone entirely new. The star is still shining over this entire reading, and every time I look at it, I keep hearing the same thought repeating inside this person's mind. What if I waited too long? Because for the first time, they're no longer wondering whether you care. They're wondering whether they still have access to the version of you that once did. And something tells me that question has been following them everywhere lately. Honestly, the energy starts getting easier here. Not because this person suddenly understands everything, but because they're finally running out of places to hide from their own feelings. You know, Pisces, sometimes people can avoid a conversation. They can avoid a decision. They can even avoid another person. What they can't avoid forever is themselves. And that's exactly what this feels like. The moment I pulled the Five of Cups, I felt this wave of regret that doesn't arrive all at once. It's the kind that builds slowly, quietly, day after day, memory after memory, realization after realization. Because this person keeps finding themselves in situations where something reminds them of you. A song, a place, a certain time of day, a familiar feeling. And every single reminder seems to lead them back to the same question. What was I actually running from? Wow. That question feels important because I don't think they were only avoiding you. I think they were avoiding what being with you would have required from them. Vulnerability, honesty, change. The kind of change that asks someone to leave behind old patterns they have carried for years. And that wasn't easy. The Three of Swords is sitting here in a way that feels deeply personal, not dramatic, not explosive. More like someone realizing that some of the pain they're carrying was created by choices they made themselves. And that's a difficult thing to sit with, because it's easier to blame timing. It's easier to blame circumstances. It's easier to blame distance. But once the noise fades away, all that's left is the truth. And the truth is becoming harder for them to ignore. Okay, I keep seeing this person replaying certain moments. Conversations they brushed aside, signals they dismissed, feelings they tried to rationalize. Because there was a period where they convinced themselves another path made more sense. Maybe it looked safer. Maybe it looked easier. Maybe it was the choice everyone around them expected them to make. And that's where the Seven of Cups starts appearing, not as confusion, not as fantasy, but as someone standing in front of too many possibilities and choosing the one that seemed most practical, the one that seemed least risky, the one that allowed them to avoid confronting what their heart already knew. And honestly, I think they're beginning to understand the cost of that choice, because life kept moving, the days kept passing, the world didn't stop. Yet something inside them remained unfinished. It's almost like they kept expecting those feelings to disappear on their own, as if enough time would somehow solve everything. But it didn't. If anything, those feelings became stronger, more persistent, more impossible to ignore. And that's why the Eight of Cups feels so emotional here. I don't see someone walking confidently toward a new chapter. I see someone realizing they can't keep pretending anymore. They can't keep carrying a version of reality that no longer fits. They can't keep telling themselves the story they've been repeating for so long. Because somewhere deep down, they know the truth, and the truth keeps finding its way back to you. This is interesting, because I don't actually feel that this realization arrived through some big event. It feels smaller than that, more human, more relatable. Like waking up one morning and suddenly understanding something that has been obvious all along. Like hearing your own thoughts clearly for the first time. Like realizing you've spent months trying to convince yourself of something you never truly believed. And Pisces, that realization can be incredibly uncomfortable, especially when it forces someone to admit they were protecting themselves instead of being honest. I keep hearing this person saying, I thought I was doing the right thing, not to justify anything, not to excuse anything, just trying to make sense of their own decisions. Because from where they stood at the time, those choices probably did seem reasonable. But perspective changes when emotions catch up. Perspective changes when enough distance exists for someone to see the entire picture. And suddenly they're noticing things they never noticed before. The way you made them feel understood. The way conversations flowed naturally. The way they could be themselves around you. The way your presence brought a kind of peace they haven't found elsewhere. You know, some connections don't become clearer while you're inside them. Sometimes clarity arrives afterward. When comparison becomes impossible to avoid. When silence becomes louder than conversation. When absence starts teaching lessons presence never could. And wow, that's exactly what feels like it's happening here. Because this person is no longer asking whether the connection mattered. That question has already been answered. What they're wrestling with now is something much harder. They're trying to understand why they fought so hard against what they were feeling. Why they kept choosing distance when closeness was what they actually wanted. Why they convinced themselves to look elsewhere when their attention kept returning to the same place. And the more they sit with those questions, the less comfortable the answers become. Because deep down, they're beginning to see that the thing they were trying hardest to avoid was never the connection itself. It was the depth of what they truly felt when they looked at you. Honestly, this energy feels different. Not heavier, not lighter, just more honest. Because there comes a point where life stops allowing someone to keep standing in the same place, emotionally. And that's exactly where I feel this person is right now. The moment death appeared, I could feel something shifting beneath the surface. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. More like a foundation that has quietly been cracking for a long time finally giving way. You know, Pisces, there are seasons in life when we hold on to things simply because they've become familiar. Even when they no longer fit. Even when we've outgrown them. Even when some part of us knows they're keeping us from becoming who we're meant to be. And I think this person has spent a long time trying to maintain something that was already changing. A version of themselves. A version of their life. A version of their future. But lately, those old structures don't feel as solid anymore. The things that once distracted them aren't working the same way. The routines that kept them busy aren't providing the same comfort. The excuses that once felt convincing suddenly sound hollow. And wow, that realization feels uncomfortable. Because once someone starts seeing the cracks, it's impossible to pretend they're not there. The energy around the hermit feels incredibly personal. I keep seeing someone pulling away from noise. Not because they want to isolate forever, but because they need space to hear themselves think. Space to understand why they feel so unsettled. Space to figure out why your name keeps appearing in their thoughts when they're not expecting it. It's almost like they've reached a point where external opinions don't carry the same weight anymore. Friends can talk, family can talk, the world can offer advice, but none of those voices seem capable of answering the questions they're carrying inside. And that's why this feels like such a private transformation. Nobody else fully understands what's happening. Most people around them probably don't even realize how much has changed internally. But inside, everything feels different. Okay, I want to stay here for a second because judgment is sitting in this reading in such an interesting way. Not as a sudden decision, not as some dramatic announcement. It feels more like awakening, like hearing a truth you've been avoiding for so long that eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. And Pisces, I think they're hearing that truth now. Not because somebody forced them, not because circumstances demanded it, but because their own heart refuses to stay silent. You know, sometimes we think growth comes from gaining new information, but often growth comes from finally accepting what we've already known. And that's exactly what this feels like. There are moments from the past resurfacing here, old conversations, old crossroads, old choices, the kind of memories that suddenly look different when viewed through a new lens. Because hindsight has a strange way of removing illusions. And speaking of illusions, the moon has such a strong presence around this energy, not in a fearful way. More like someone wandering through a landscape they've never fully understood. I keep feeling this person looking back at periods of uncertainty in their life. Times when they didn't trust themselves. Times when fear spoke louder than intuition. Times when confusion felt safer than clarity. And honestly, I think they're starting to realize how many decisions were made from that place. Not from love, not from confidence, not from certainty, but from fear. Fear of being vulnerable, fear of making the wrong choice, fear of losing control, fear of stepping into something that felt deeper than anything they had experienced before. Wow, that hits hard. Because when somebody starts recognizing how much fear influenced their actions, they begin seeing their entire story differently. And that's what I feel happening here. They're no longer viewing the past through the same eyes. They're seeing patterns, connections, moments that didn't make sense before. The moon keeps pulling them toward truths hidden beneath the surface, truths they once avoided, truths they once questioned, truths they once convinced themselves weren't real. But the more honest they become with themselves, the clearer those truths appear. And one of those truths seems to involve you. Not necessarily because you're the answer to every question they're carrying, but because your presence somehow became connected to a version of themselves they weren't ready to face. A version that wanted more, a version that felt deeply, a version that wasn't interested in pretending. And now, that version is becoming harder to ignore, because the life they're standing in today doesn't feel exactly the same anymore. Something is ending, something is dissolving, something that once felt permanent is slowly losing its hold. And I don't think they're grieving the ending itself. I think they're grieving the amount of time they spent believing they could avoid it. The strange thing is, beneath all this uncertainty, I can feel a growing sense of clarity trying to emerge, very quietly, very slowly, almost like the first light appearing before sunrise. Nothing is fully visible yet. Nothing is completely understood, but there is movement, there is awareness, there is a deep internal shift unfolding. And the more they sit alone with these thoughts, the more one particular realization keeps returning. Not as a question anymore, not as a possibility, but as something their soul seems determined to keep placing directly in front of them. And honestly, this is where the energy becomes impossible to ignore, because whatever this person tried to push aside, whatever they tried to bury beneath responsibilities, distractions, or time itself, keeps finding its way back to the surface. The moment the Six of Cups appeared, I could feel memories moving through this reading. Not just random memories, specific ones. The kind that arrive without warning. A laugh they still remember. A conversation they thought they had forgotten. A look you gave them once that suddenly makes sense years later. You know, it's strange how memory works. We don't always remember the biggest moments. Sometimes it's the smallest things that stay with us. The way somebody listened. The way somebody understood. The way somebody made us feel safe enough to be ourselves. And that's what keeps surfacing here. Because this person isn't just remembering events, they're remembering how they felt around you. Wow. That feels important. Because feelings are much harder to explain away than facts. Facts can be debated. Facts can be rationalized. Feelings tend to linger. And I keep seeing them experiencing little moments throughout the day where your energy somehow slips back into their awareness. They're driving somewhere. You're on their mind. They're working. You're on their mind. They're talking to somebody else. And somehow a comparison appears, not intentionally, not because they're trying to hold on to the past. It just happens. Because something about your presence created an imprint they haven't been able to replace. The High Priestess feels incredibly strong here, almost as if there has always been a part of this connection operating beneath the surface, something unspoken, something neither of you fully put into words. And honestly, I think that unspoken space is exactly where they keep returning. Because when they think about you, it isn't only what happened between you that captures their attention. It's everything that never happened, everything that never got explored, everything that remains suspended between possibility and reality, the conversations that never occurred, the feelings that never received a name, the opportunities that were never fully pursued. And Pisces, those unfinished stories have a way of staying alive in someone's heart, especially when life begins teaching them lessons they weren't ready to learn before. Okay. I need to talk about the star because it keeps glowing throughout this entire reading. Every time I look at it, I get this feeling that they see you differently now, not through the lens of expectation, not through the lens of familiarity, but through the lens of appreciation. And there is a difference, because people often appreciate things most after they've experienced life without them. This person has started noticing qualities in you they once took for granted, your kindness, your patience, your emotional depth. The way you never forced people to become something they weren't. The way you allowed others to discover themselves in their own time. Honestly, they may not have fully understood how rare that was. Not until they encountered situations that lacked those qualities. Not until they realized how many people only listen to respond. How many people only stay when it's convenient. How many people struggle to offer the kind of understanding that came so naturally to you. And that's where the Queen of Cups enters this story again. Not as somebody waiting, not as somebody sacrificing themselves, but as a reflection of what they now recognize. Because when they think of you, they don't see chaos, they don't see drama, they don't see games. They see emotional maturity, they see warmth. They see somebody who carried a depth they weren't prepared to meet at the time. And wow, that realization feels bittersweet, because appreciation arriving late can be painful. Not because appreciation itself hurts, but because it forces someone to confront what they overlooked, what they misunderstood, what they failed to nurture when it was standing right in front of them. I keep hearing this person ask themselves questions they don't have answers to. What if I had been more honest? What if I hadn't been afraid? What if I had trusted what I was feeling? Those questions aren't coming from a place of self-punishment. They feel more reflective than that, more human, more vulnerable, like somebody standing at the edge of a memory trying to understand why it still affects them so deeply. And the truth seems surprisingly simple. You mattered more than they admitted, more than they acknowledged, possibly even more than they understood. Because if this were only attraction, it would have faded. If this were only curiosity, it would have disappeared. If this were only temporary, life would have carried them somewhere else emotionally. Yet here they are, still thinking, still remembering, still feeling. The high priestess keeps whispering that there's more happening inside them than anyone around them realizes. Most people probably think they're fine. Most people probably think they've moved on. Most people probably have no idea how often your energy crosses their mind, because this is not the kind of thing they're openly discussing. This is happening internally, quietly, privately, in moments when nobody else is watching. And what fascinates me most is that the harder they once tried to understand you logically, the less success they had. But the more they allow themselves to simply feel, the clearer everything becomes. Almost as if their heart has been carrying information their mind refused to acknowledge. And that awareness keeps growing, little by little, day by day, memory by memory, until it starts becoming impossible for them to pretend that you were just another chapter in their life. Because every road their thoughts seem to travel eventually circles back to the same place, back to the same connection, back to the same feeling, back to the same person they can't seem to forget no matter how much time passes. And you know, what keeps standing out to me here is that this person doesn't feel rushed. They feel careful, almost unusually careful. Because once someone begins seeing a situation clearly, there comes a moment when they realize that acting impulsively could create even more distance. And honestly, I think they're very aware of that. The Two of Pentacles keeps showing me someone trying to keep multiple parts of their life balanced at the same time. Not because they don't know what they want. Actually, I think they're becoming increasingly certain about what they want. The challenge seems to be everything surrounding that realization. Responsibilities, obligations, commitments they can't simply walk away from overnight. Practical realities that still require attention. And Pisces, I feel like that's frustrating for them, because emotional clarity arrived faster than their circumstances could change. Wow, that feels significant because for a long time, uncertainty may have been the problem. But uncertainty isn't the problem anymore. The problem is figuring out how to align reality with what their heart has already accepted. I keep seeing someone sitting quietly, thinking about the future in ways they never allowed themselves to before. Not fantasy, not wishful thinking, actual future. The kind that asks serious questions. What would happen if I reached out? What would happen if I stopped hiding? What would happen if I finally chose differently? Those questions keep repeating, and every time they ask them, something inside them feels a little less afraid, because the energy around the world feels like a chapter nearing completion, not ending abruptly, not collapsing, completing, like a door that's been slowly closing for months finally reaching the frame, like loose threads finally being tied together, like lessons that took years to learn suddenly making sense. And honestly, I think they can feel it. Even if they can't explain it, there's this awareness growing inside them that they cannot continue carrying the same patterns into the future. Some version of themselves is being left behind, a version that delayed, a version that hesitated, a version that always believed there would be another opportunity later. The strange thing is, the more they release those old habits, the more they start thinking about possibility. And that's where the Three of Wands enters this reading. Not as action, not yet. It feels more like anticipation. Like somebody standing at the edge of a shoreline staring toward a horizon they never thought they'd reach. I keep feeling curiosity here, hope, a cautious kind of optimism, because for the first time in a very long time, they're allowing themselves to imagine an outcome that once felt impossible. They're allowing themselves to imagine being honest, being vulnerable, being seen, and wow, that is not something this person does easily, especially if they've spent most of their life protecting themselves, especially if they've learned to rely on logic whenever emotions became too intense. But something is changing. Something inside them is becoming softer, more willing, more open. And every time I look at the King of Cups, I feel that transformation. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet strength. The kind that develops when somebody finally stops running from their own feelings. Because I don't see emotional chaos here. I see emotional maturity beginning to emerge. I see somebody learning how to sit with their emotions instead of fighting them. Learning how to understand them instead of suppressing them. Learning how to respect them instead of dismissing them. And Pisces, that changes everything. Because people from the room look courage like taking action. Sometimes courage is simply allowing yourself to feel what you've spent years avoiding. This person seems to be discovering that, one realization at a time, one quiet moment at a time, one honest conversation with themselves at a time. Okay, there's something else here. I keep feeling them look toward the future and seeing you in it. Not necessarily in a detailed way. Not planning every step. Not imagining every outcome. Just noticing that when they picture the life they actually want, your energy naturally appears somewhere within that vision. And that surprises them. Because I don't think they expected that. I don't think they expected you to remain such a constant presence in their heart. Especially after everything that has happened. Especially after all the time that has passed. Yet every road they mentally travel seems to bring them back to the same place. Back to the same connection, back to the same possibility, back to the same person. And honestly, that consistency is beginning to tell them something important. Because temporary feelings fade. Temporary interests disappear. Temporary attractions move on. What they're experiencing feels different. It has survived distance. It has survived uncertainty. It has survived silence. The King of Cups keeps showing me somebody becoming more emotionally honest with themselves than they've ever been before. And with that honesty comes responsibility. Because once you know the truth, pretending becomes much harder. Once you understand what matters, distractions lose their power. Once you recognize what your heart has been trying to say, ignoring it becomes exhausting. I think they're reaching that point. The point where excuses no longer feel convincing. The point where fear no longer feels protective. The point where waiting begins to feel heavier than moving forward. And there's this growing sense that the pieces are slowly falling into place. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough for them to start realizing that the future they've been imagining may not stay imaginary forever. Because something about this horizon they've been staring at is beginning to feel closer than it did before. And the closer it feels, the more one particular thought keeps returning to them whenever your name crosses their mind. Not what if, not anymore. Something much more real than that, something they haven't quite found the courage to say out loud yet. And honestly, this feels like the moment where everything they've been carrying internally starts searching for a way out. Because feelings can stay hidden for a while, thoughts can stay private for a while, but eventually, something wants to be expressed. Something wants to be spoken, something wants to be known. The moment the Eight of Wands appeared, I felt movement, not rushed movement, not impulsive movement. More like the kind that happens after a very long period of hesitation. The kind that happens when someone finally realizes that silence is no longer protecting them. You know, there's a difference between waiting because you're being careful and waiting because you're afraid. I think this person is beginning to recognize that difference. Because every reason they once used to justify staying quiet feels less convincing than it used to. The distance doesn't feel easier anymore. The uncertainty doesn't feel safer anymore. And the thought of never saying anything honestly feels heavier than the possibility of being vulnerable. Wow, that realization changes everything. Because this isn't somebody trying to force an outcome. This isn't somebody trying to control what happens next. This feels like somebody reaching a point where they simply need to be honest. Even if that honesty feels uncomfortable. Even if it feels risky. Even if they don't know exactly how you'll respond. The Ace of Cups feels incredibly emotional here. Not because they're overwhelmed. Actually, I think they're clearer than they've been in a very long time. The emotional confusion that once surrounded this connection seems to be fading. And underneath all of it, something simple remains. Something genuine, something they can no longer deny. I keep feeling them imagining a conversation, replaying it, changing the words, starting over, trying again. Wondering how to explain everything that happened inside them without making it sound smaller than it really was. Because some experiences change you quietly. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with certainty. They simply settle into your heart until one day you realize they've become part of who you are, and that's what this connection feels like to them. Not temporary, not forgettable, not something they can neatly place in a box and move beyond. Okay, there's something incredibly vulnerable showing up here. Because I don't think they only want to talk about their feelings. I think they want to explain themselves, not to justify, not to erase the past, not to rewrite history, just to finally tell the truth. The truth about what was happening inside them when they appeared distant. The truth about what they were struggling with. The truth about the fears they never admitted. The truth about the choices they didn't fully understand until much later. And honestly, that feels terrifying for them. Because vulnerability always carries risk, especially when someone genuinely cares about the outcome. The Two of Cups keeps appearing like a quiet question hanging in the air. Not a guarantee, not a prediction, just a question. A deeply human question. What if there's still something here? What if the connection hasn't disappeared? What if the door isn't completely closed? And Pisces, I think that's what they keep wondering. Because no matter how much reflection they've done, no matter how much clarity they've gained, one thing remains outside their control. You, your feelings, your perspective, your choices. And for perhaps the first time, they're recognizing that they cannot assume anything. They cannot assume you'll still be waiting. They cannot assume you'll still feel the same. They cannot assume they have unlimited time. Wow. That awareness makes this energy feel very sincere, because ego usually assumes. Ego expects. Ego demands certainty. This doesn't feel like ego. This feels like somebody standing before the unknown and deciding to be honest anyway. The Fool is fascinating here, because every time I look at this card, I don't see recklessness. I see courage. The quiet kind. The kind that asks someone to step forward without knowing exactly where the path leads. The kind that asks someone to trust themselves enough to take the first step. And honestly, that first step may be the hardest one. The first message, the first conversation, the first moment of honesty. The first time saying something they've rehearsed 100 times in their head but never spoken aloud. I keep hearing them think, I just need them to know. Not I need a specific outcome. Not I need everything to go my way. Just, I need them to know. Because some truths eventually become too important to keep hidden. Some feelings eventually become too real to ignore. And the strange thing is, the more they accept that possibility, the calmer they become. Not because they're free from fear. The fear is still there. But something else has become stronger. Something steadier. Something more authentic. Desire to stop carrying unfinished words. A desire to stop living inside assumptions. A desire to discover what happens when honesty finally replaces uncertainty. And Pisces, the energy here feels like someone standing at the edge of a moment they've imagined countless times. A moment that once felt distant. A moment that once felt impossible. A moment that slowly became more real with every lesson, every realization, every memory that refused to fade. Because after everything they've learned about themselves, after everything they've finally allowed themselves to feel, there seems to be one last thing their heart wants to find out. Whether the connection they can no longer deny is something they're carrying alone, or whether somewhere on the other side of this silence, there's still a heartbeat that remembers them too. All right, Pisces, that's where we're going to leave this reading for today. And honestly, I feel like this story is still unfolding. There are some things that can only be understood with time, some feelings that reveal themselves slowly, and some conversations that happen only when people are finally ready to be honest with themselves. So trust what your intuition has been showing you. Trust the growth you've worked so hard for. And most importantly, keep choosing the peace you've fought to create. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this space with me. I truly appreciate your time, your energy, and your support. If this reading resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Take care of yourselves, Pisces. And remember, sometimes the answers we've been waiting for begin arriving the moment we stop chasing them. Okay, I'll see you in the next reading. Bye.